Would a Brexit be bad news for London's bankers and lawyers? Let's hear from the panellists. As usual, we're going to do 2 for, 2 against. They'll alternate their opening statements before we open it up to Q&A with you. So do ready some questions, and then we'll have very quick 1.5-minute closing statements before we vote again.
Thank you, Chairman. Last week I was doing a similar debate with the Institute of Actuaries, so it's pleasing to have a rather less lively audience tonight. Having seen the results of the poll, I thought the best thing I could do is probably sit down, as there seems only one way from those sort of results. But I better make my speech. Actually, I really don't care whether Brexit would be bad news for bankers, and I care even less whether it would be bad news for lawyers. But I do care about jobs in London and throughout the country, and I do care about London, the world's greatest and most international city and the financial centre of Europe. Let's look at another city institution not far from here, JP Morgan. JP Morgan's got something over 16,000 staff serving the European Union in the European Union. 15,000 of them are in the United Kingdom, the majority in London, but many in Bournemouth and Glasgow. And to quote the Chief Executive, Jamie Dimon, if we can't passport out of the UK, we would have to set up different operations in Europe. Now, some might say this isn't a problem. And for JP Morgan, they could do it, albeit at some cost. But what would be lost would be jobs in London, in Bournemouth, and in Glasgow. And not just bankers, who, as you gather, I care little about, but other jobs not only within the company, but in suppliers large and small. So what about the upside? Freedom from Brussels red tape. When I ask the question such as, I'm generally met with silence. Brexit would be bad for the city. It would be bad for London, and it would be bad for jobs throughout the UK. And it would mean significantly less tax revenue, which helps underpin so many of the public services we rely on.
There is, of course, nothing inherently European about financial or legal services. Capital and knowledge, the tools of our trade, should know no borders. They both pass with a click of a mouse from London to Paris to Frankfurt to New York to Singapore in an instant. For lawyers working from London, there is no expectation that our client is in the UK or in the European Union. We are, of course, happy to take instructions from anywhere in the world within reason. Whether you are a lender or whether you are a borrower, your primary concern is not the nationality of your counterparty, but creditworthiness, cost of capital, and your appetite for risk and reward. Because of the global nature of the financial system, it does not make sense for regulatory standards to be British or European, but to be global. And that is increasingly happening, with a global policy agenda in financial services regulation being driven by the G20. Secondly, there is the question of the technical detail of bank capital itself. The global bank capital standards are, rightly, a set of minimum standards, not a set of maximum standards, allowing countries to go above and beyond those minimum standards where necessary for them. The Bank of England has argued, in the context of its financial stability objective and EU law, that as host to a large internationally integrated financial sector, the UK may need to go further and adopt tighter regulatory standards than are appropriate for smaller, domestic-focused financial systems. However, because the Capital Requirements Directive is largely a maximum harmonisation measure, the ability of the UK government and UK authorities to tighten regulatory standards is limited. Were we to leave the EU, we would, of course, continue to commit to global minimum standards in bank capital and other areas and contribute to the setting of these, just as we do now. But unlike now, we would be able to tailor the legislation implementing those standards to the specific needs of our economy, liberalising in some areas, such as bankers' bonuses, and tightening them in others, such as capital requirements. To be a successful global financial centre, what is required is strong, fair, and commercial legal regulatory environment, and an openness to global trade. These are things that are entirely within our gift if we leave the EU, but within the EU's gift if we remain.
We can cut to the chase with a quote from a familiar face on your televisions. We are committed to playing a leading role in the European Union in order to advance our national interest. The single market is one of the greatest forces for prosperity the continent's ever known, and that's why we'll continue to push an ambitious programme of deepening the single market while seeking to reduce unnecessary burdens in EU legislation. And that was William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, in July 2012, launching what came to be called the Balance of Competences Review. You might expect Lord Lamont, as a former Tory Chancellor, to agree not only with William Hague, but also with all 4 Prime Ministers since 1990, and indeed Lady Thatcher, who campaigned strongly both for UK membership and for the internal market programme, and also with the present Tory Chancellor, the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, HM Treasury, and the Bank of England, and the specific advice of our closest and most powerful ally, the USA. Instead, I understand he's on the other side, although of course he's always welcome to change. I'm not sure if he endorses what has been unflatteringly but essentially accurately been described as the utopian rubbish put out by Michael Gove yesterday, or with the unpromising and unedifying contributions of the Mayor of London, calling the President of the USA a hypocrite, describing the EU as crap, and dismissing his opponent's arguments by using expressions such as baloney, knickers and bollocks, rather than by advancing any sensible arguments. So far as the lawyers are concerned, I'd identify 4 problems. First of all, and the most obvious and commercially significant, harm to the city would be harm to the legal profession, whose most valuable clients are the leading financial institutions and their major customers. Secondly, neither freedom of establishment nor freedom to provide services would be guaranteed to non-members of the EU. They can only be guaranteed by establishment within the EU. Thirdly, the UK is not only the foremost centre for international finance, but also for international dispute resolution. That's underpinned to a substantial degree by common rules on enforcement and jurisdiction within the EU. There's no guarantee that this would remain in place under any revised trading relationship.
You've got a minute from that.
Finally, last but not least of my list, loss of influence over the development of EU law. Just as the Bank of England has considerable input into the form of regulation within the EU, so English lawyers and judges have had a major influence over the development of EU law. That would be lost. We would have no advocates general, we would have no judges in the Court of Justice, we would have no right to appear, we would have no right to intervene, whereas now we can appear in every case before the Court of Justice. That would be a very considerable and specific loss. So far as quantifying all this, just as the Treasury made an attempt to quantify with some criticism during this week, the Law Society commissioned an independent report at the end of 2015 by Oxford Economics, which reached very similar conclusions. They found that providers of legal services would be disproportionately affected by any adverse economic effects resulting from UK departure. They found that the longer-term effects were adverse on all the scenarios they considered plausible, and on the worst-case scenario, they said that UK growth in the legal sector by 2030 could be reduced by 1.7 billion, equivalent to the total turnover of the 4 largest UK firms combined. In summary, leaving the EU would be bad for the UK economy, bad for banks, bad for banking, bad for lawyers, and bad for the law. Thank you.
For me, this is primarily a political question rather than an economic question. I regard the economics of being in or leaving as really pretty evenly balanced and not dramatic on either side. But I regard the politics of remaining in the European Union as full of risks. And I think it is behoven on everybody to think about that. I voted in 1975 for Britain to be in the EEC. It's the only time I've ever spoken in favour of Europe in Trafalgar Square alongside Kenneth Clarke. I did that. But I believe that what we were joining then, as was promised in the white paper, it said there is no possibility of monetary union. And of course, in the 45 years that has passed since, Europe has profoundly changed. It has an elected parliament, directly elected, which we were told would not happen. It has a single currency. Because of the single currency, it is moving more and more to fiscal integration, which means one European government. When I became Chancellor, I discovered something I'd always been told to regard as just a myth, something they didn't really believe was true, that actually Europe wanted to create a United States of Europe. Europe is a country under construction. The alternative is that we will trade with the European Union as other countries trade with the European Union. People talk about access as though this was some massive problem, as though there was some gigantic wall around the European Union. Switzerland exports 5 times as much per capita to the EU as we do, despite not being a member. And the real threat to the City of London is from excessive regulation, becoming uncompetitive globally by having to observe too much financial regulation. Mr. Chairman, just over a minute. I would end simply by saying there is no status quo either in staying in or getting out. The world is going to change whether you're in or out. The European Union has changed profoundly from how it was 45 years ago. We only get occasionally a chance to let our voice be heard on this. But bear in mind, 10% of the votes in the European Council, 8% of the votes in the European Parliament. I would rather have a situation where we had lawmakers that we could hold accountable, lawmakers that we could dismiss. I would like to get our country back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.